lazy or somebody being clueless in a situation like this.
Or pissed off, I think, is the other thing. Well, I'll fix them, you know? I can't help but think that that's part of some plumbers are just like,
with some
you
plumbers,
didn't leave me any options, so I'm just going to cut.
It was some plumber's mother-in-law's house.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. I'm joined by Deputy Editor Matt Milham.
Hello.
And Rob Watsack, Digital Brand Manager.
Hey.
And producer Jeff Rose.
Hi there.
Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Wow, so we got a lot of feedback on episode 214.
Okay.
And that's just coming in, so I think we should start right with that. For starters, we heard from Andy Engel, who I think we talked about a little bit maybe in that episode. I don't know.
I don't even remember.
He says, so I wanted to bust chops on PC 214, but first some praise. I listened to the podcast while doing an hour's ride on my stationary bike. As any cyclist can tell you, riding a stationary bike is the purgatory we go through so the spring outdoor rides don't hurt so much. The podcast made that hour's ride, if not pleasurable, at least not suck as much as usual. So we've heard a lot of nice things, and this might be the nicest thing we've ever heard.
Well, I mean, the podcast alone might get your heart rate up enough, but you don't even need to worry about the bike.
A third less suck.
So he says regarding the 9,000 square foot deep energy retrofit, Nessie, the New England Sustainable Energy Association, has suggested that using more wood-based products in building can reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. If the 9,000 square foot remodel uses double stud walls, cellulose insulation, Gutex on the outside, and so forth, it might become carbon neutral or carbon negative. Maybe the size of the house is less important than how it's built and the quality of life it offers its residents.
Can I talk about that for a second?
Sure.
Old trees sequester more carbon than younger trees, because as trees get bigger, they sequester more carbon. Like every ring is bigger than the one before it.
Okay.
In circumference. So when you cut down an old tree to make anything, and then you plant a new tree, new trees aren't like mammals. They don't like grow real fast and then stop growing at a particular point. Trees are sort of like the opposite. And then you're left with the stump and the roots that end up decaying and creating methane gas. And that has a global warming potential far beyond the carbon
CO2,
dioxide.
right.
Yeah, by like up to almost 300 times more. So that can be a little problematic. I don't know if they're figuring that into their equations when they're talking about using wood fiber as insulation.
My guess is no, because the most recent discussion I heard about using forest biomass for heating, especially in Europe, doesn't take into account any of the carbon release associated with the cutting down the trees.
Right. Yeah, they're just saying it's neutral because the trees are taking up carbon dioxide, and then you're putting that right back in the atmosphere when you burn it.
Yeah, but there's some...
and then they're totally neglecting the fact that all this other stuff that's left in the ground is making worse gases.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, that's one of the big things in green building from the beginning was like building more sustainable homes. And you talk about the value of individual materials out of context and doing a life cycle analysis of a material based on its, its origin and its production and processing and all that kind of stuff. It's such a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, will we ever be able to tell if one material is going to be better than another 100 years from now? I don't know. It's a tough thing to get into.
Yeah, that's not to say that stuff might not be better than the other things that we're using.
Sure.
The amount of carbon dioxide you're creating or putting in the atmosphere by like creating rock wool or anything
concrete
like that is far beyond. But anyway.
Polystyrene.
Yeah.
Pick your poison. In my experience, this is Andy also goes on to say, in my experience, a 7-degree bevel on a door is a bit much. I use about half that, which is enough to allow the door edge to clear the jamb while still allowing its face to meet the stop. On very thick doors, like the 4-inch, even 3 degrees is too much. I also bevel the hinge side to prevent the door from binding. Do you know what he's talking about?
Yeah, because we were talking about my new door, and you had brought up 7 degrees, and I didn't go anywhere near that. I did 3.
Yeah, so I was off base.
Yeah,
I was wrong.
That is really steep.
Yeah.
7 degrees would be really steep, but nobody said anything at the time.
So thanks, Andy, for setting me straight.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically the binding is if you don't have that jamb perfectly square to the framing and it's tilting
We're talking
out,
on the hinge side.
on the hinge side.
Yeah, so you want to bevel that side too so that the door is not hitting against the jamb when it's closed, right?
Yeah.
You want a little space there. And
Yeah, and when I bought a bunch of like Brosco slabs, they came with a bevel on both sides, like he's talking about.
yeah. I think that's standard.
Yeah.
You need to do that. Okay. And then he goes on to Harbor Freight, which is in reference to Andy Grace's discussion of things he buys at Harbor Freight and finds to be useful. So Andy goes on to say, Harbor Freight, or as my friends call it, hazard fraught. Yeah, I have some of their tools. I did have your old drywall lift, which after the brake failed and it dropped a sheet of 5/8 drywall on my head, it was easily repaired using an old leather belt for a new brake shoe. So high marks for it being repairable by a Swamp Yankee engineer. As far as I know, it's still in service. I sold it to Chris Green for slightly less than I bought it from you for. So if you need to borrow it, call him, not me.
Yeah, it is still in service because I did ask Chris to borrow it recently.
I've got one in my basement too.
Do you?
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll remember that.
Yeah.
Good to know. Bungee cords. Can we please stop using these things? I know two people who have lost an eye to breaking bungees. One of them is the venerable Gary Katz. Well, I would very much like to get rid of bungee cords, but I mean, like anything that has a tarp on it, you need to secure it with a bungee because it's going to...
Ratchet straps.
Really?
There's there's other things. I usually use ratchet straps, although I will say they don't do a great job of like keeping the corners down. You need to use
That's
a lot
the thing.
of them.
You need something that's always under tension because it's going to move with temperature, right? So on my wood pile, I can't imagine like holding the tarp down with ratchet straps.
I think you could get away with it. For the most part, my tarp is held over my wood pile with just bagged sand.
I was going to say, yeah, get a bigger tarp. Throw some rocks on it.
I will say that I do turn my head when I stretch the bungees to attach them.
Oh, yeah. No. Use safety glasses.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, I'm sure somewhere on the little tag that comes on a bungee cord, it tells you to use safety glasses, and that's probably not a bad idea.
I mean, that goes to something. How many, I want to hear people writing in about this. How many of you on a regular basis will use power saws or any other tools without safety glasses or without any glasses on? Because every workshop, every cabinet shop I've ever been in, I've been in the minority of people who will not touch one of those tools without a pair of safety glasses on.
Well, I think Matt and I would both agree that when we go to job sites, requires constant vigilance on our part to make people wear their gear for the photography.
Yeah.
And we used to not hear anything about dangerous practices in the magazine, but there's been a sea change, I would say, in the last few years. And I kind of agree. Like, we're supposed to be an example of best practice, and that includes safety in addition to fine home building, right?
Yeah, and it only takes one big shard of wood for you to become a pirate for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and I mean, how many people do we know who have had very serious injuries on a construction site? It's like a lot of us. So, thanks, Andy. That was fun. So this one is from Ryan in Redondo.
You left out the best part, didn't you?
The
Oh,
casters.
yes. So one of the things, I'm sorry.
I was in on that project.
So one of the things Andy mentioned was that he buys casters from Harbor Freight. I don't think he was referring to the like little dollies that Andy bought, which were described as 3-wheel dollies, and they're supposed to go under a leg of some heavy piece of furniture, right, Rob?
Yeah, so Andy Engel's wife is Andy's building a kitchen in the basement of their house.
A commercial kitchen.
Commercial kitchen. And they had these massive ovens that we actually had to take the door apart in order to get them in the building.
Not just the door. They take off the jamb.
The whole
And
jamb.
the buck.
Yeah, and lift him in there with his front end loader. And the fact that he had to lift those ovens with a front end loader should have told you that the Harbor Freight little 6-inch dollies weren't going to support the weight of the oven.
So they had allegedly 125-pound weight rating, and we had 4 of them on each of the 4 legs. So conceivably, it should have been able to move 500 pounds, right?
Yeah.
They folded immediately. I don't know what the weight of the oven was, but that proved to be a waste. It did not work at all. So this is from Ryan from Redondo Beach. Hi, FHB crew. I was just listening to the pod on heat pump water heaters and was floored you didn't mention the Sandin models, given you were talking about embodied energy just before. You totally neglected the global warming potential of the refrigerant in the discussion, and it's certainly worth mentioning that Sandin's units use CO2, which has a global warming potential of 1. I do agree with your points on parts availability in your local market, but as a community that's interested in efficiency in the planet, let's create the demand so the supply has the opportunity to respond. Did I say that right? Let's create the demand so the supply has the opportunity to respond.
Totally legitimate.
You think?
I think so. I mean, these things are, as far as I can tell, pretty fantastic. The one thing that's a little weird.
Let's tell folks what it is first.
Yeah, it's a heat pump water heater, but it's a 2-part system. So it's similar to, like, I don't know,
a mini
split. And then
or
it has
a conventional air conditioning unit, right?
Yeah.
You have a coil inside and a condenser outside.
Yeah. But they have like a coefficient of efficiency. It's like 3.84 or something like that, which is about as good as you can get.
Yep.
Yeah, they just look fantastic.
So it seems odd to me that I hadn't heard about these before, because you think about them. We're complaining about all these refrigerants and their global warming potential, and CO2, which is readily available and not as much of a concern. It's just crazy to think that it can run much more efficiently than all these fancy.
But it's not as efficient as a heat transfer gas, right? You need a gas with a high vaporization rate of vaporization. Anyway, it needs to be good at absorbing.
Yeah, extremely volatile, and also have a high thermal capacity or whatever.
So my guess is CO2 has less, or we'd see more of it, I presume.
Yeah.
So, okay. All right. I agree.
I mean, any gas that you compress and then release is going to cool down. Like, you can do it just with, regular air.
Yep.
But yeah, CO2 is probably marginally better than air. So, I mean, it probably doesn't work nearly as well as some of these like highly volatile compounds. But if they're achieving an efficiency of 3.84 with something that's relatively harmless, that they're just extracting from the air to begin with, they're not like creating new CO2 probably for these.
They asked me to come and talk a lot, and I couldn't capture it. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to cut you off here, Rob. Yeah. I think this is a very interesting product, but I have a very hard time getting over the $4,000 price point.
It's $4,000, and good luck finding one locally.
Yeah.
That's the thing I wonder is, like, are there enough installers in your area? But like you said, people need to start buying them to create that demand.
So it's a weird thing, because ordinarily refrigeration equipment is done by the HVAC guy, but now all of a sudden you're dealing with domestic water. So like, who's qualified to do this? My presumption is it would have to be someone who had expertise in both trades.
Yeah, and I mean, trolling around on their website a little bit, it looked like there's a lot of there is a decent amount of distribution in some areas, but it doesn't it didn't say anything about installers, so I don't know.
But to the question about supply, demand leading supply, it's like that's just like any other new product. Like, even when solar panels started becoming popular on houses,
they had to be incentivized, right?
Yes, and then, but even with them being incentivized, before there was like a plan in place with solar installers to do all the paperwork. Like, the fact, I probably would never have gotten solar panels on my roof if they hadn't made the process extremely simple, where I literally just had to sign some papers and they did all the paperwork and got me all the information on the tax credits and all that stuff. Because doing all that homework as a homeowner is kind of a daunting task. So in the early days, I think it was often people who just felt really strongly about doing this for environmental reasons and had the money to front the system, to pay for the system like this. So
here's another question. So admittedly, the coefficient of performance on this is better than a standard electric resistance heater, or even like all-in-one heat pump water heater, right? Mm-hmm. But like, okay, so for me, a good fundamental way to determine the embodied energy in something is, what does it cost, right? So this thing costs $4,000. That tells me it has a lot more stuff in it than something that costs considerably less. Am I wrong in that assumption?
I don't know. I mean, you may be paying for R&D
Yeah.
And I don't know where these things are produced. I think it's an Australian company, so I don't know if they're getting shipped, over the ocean or what. Exactly how they're coming
and like
in.
anything that's new that's produced in lower volume, it's obviously going to be more expensive until they reach certain volume production.
Well, if there's anyone out there who has a stand-in heat pump style water heater, I would love to hear from you. Tell me what your experience was, who installed it, what it cost. Are you realizing the energy savings that you anticipated, and are there any other trade-offs related to this product that we haven't thought about?
Yeah, I know Mike Maines has tried to spec them for houses, but apparently just because of the cost, it hasn't actually worked out yet.
Yeah, and I mean, there's lots of things I think spending money on is great, right? This one, I think it's just it's a big premium. Let's just put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody else wrote in about our discussion of heat pump water heaters. FHB team, this is a quick follow-up on the topic of hybrid water heaters you discussed in this week's podcast. I have two 50-gallon GE GeoSpring units, one I've had for 6 years and the other for 5. For several years, Oregon had a program that provided 100% rebate on the cost of the unit plus plumbing materials. When we went to solar, also huge subsidies here, the state performed an energy audit and recommended the water heaters as the next step toward net zero. It was a no-brainer to upgrade. We did the replacements in subsequent years to take full advantage of the rebates. Why two? The house is fairly large with a water heater at each end. The hot water never travels more than about 12 feet. My experience has been very positive. We saw a significant drop in electricity and have had no performance issues. The difference is from a standard electric water heater. It has a larger size due to the compressor on top, and you need to add a condensate drain. Neither of these posed an issue for us. I also need to clean the filters once every few months. So, would I pay about $1,000 out of pocket instead of $500 for a basic electric model? Now that I have experience with them, I'd say yes. The payback is clear, and the energy footprint is less. I'm an avid listener, and I really appreciate the effort you all put into the podcast. Regards, Troy. Thanks, Troy. So there's someone who's lived with a GeoSpring. Unfortunately, they don't make that anymore. It's made by someone else now. Ream, right?
Yeah, somebody bought it.
I forget who that was.
So you guys going to put one of these in your house one day?
I thought about it.
Yeah. I was this close when I put the mini splits in to just tack them onto that project, because the guy who did my Mitsubishi mini splits could have done it for me, but I kind of want to pour that slab in my basement first.
Yeah. Well, and now that you have solar, and I mean, the previous commenter said at the end, I would like to point out that electric resistance water heaters don't use refrigerant.
That's me.
Oh, that's
that was
you.
me. That was
that's
my
you.
note.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's true. And so if you have solar and you have enough capacity to be able to run an electric water heater, then that almost seems like a no-brainer too, and whether you need to go to a heat pump or just a regular, resistance
I guess
heater.
it's how much surplus electricity you're generating,
Well,
right?
so that's the thing, is that I've got a 10 kilowatt system on my roof, and just this month or next month, I think just this month, it will be the first time I'll actually have an electric bill. The surplus started covering my bill in November, my deficit in November and December, and I think January, February, and maybe March I'll have a small
So you're going to
bill.
tell the family not to use any lights or appliances for the next few months?
Yeah, they're only allowed to take a bath in a tank that I just keep the water in for the whole month.
Yeah.
But
I would put like a little meter on some appliances.
But I did. The hot water heater really is a significant portion of my electricity. That's the only reason I was really considering it, because I think if I did go to a more efficient water heater, that I would be able to keep the surplus. I wouldn't have to have an electric bill at all.
Man, that's kind
But
of
again,
cool.
that's the thing that only works when you have one of those net metering
Arrangements.
arrangements.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not available everywhere.
Well, these are all great emails. Thank you all for writing in with feedback about the program. We do really like to hear from you all how we're doing, good, bad, otherwise. So you fixed your, what should we call it, lighting situation?
Yeah, it was easy. I just ran a new cable.
So you ran a cable down the wall to put a switch on.
Yeah, just drilled a hole in the top plate.
And you did what's
right stud
described as a switch loop, which means you're getting power to the fixture. You're running down one conductor to the switch.
Yep.
If the switch is on, it's sending conductor back up to the box in the ceiling and turning on the fixture.
Yeah. Got to label the neutral for hot.
Right. You should tape it black, right? Yeah.
Which is exactly what I did.
Very good. So angry electricians out there, Matt did his job.
Yeah, my dad's an electrician, so I whenever I have any questions, I didn't need to ask him about this. I told him what I did, and he was just like, "Yep."
That's cool. So that wiring baffled me for a couple of years in my 20s until you get your head around you're just interrupting it and sending it somewhere else and then stopping it or sending it back.
Yep.
And you've been doing wiring too.
Yeah, I redid my daughter's bedroom, I don't know how many years ago, a few years ago, and she only had one outlet in our 1870s house. They were kind of skimpy with the outlets. She only had one outlet in her room. So
that was nothing to plug into.
Yeah, so I gutted the walls and re-insulated when I did the room, so I ran new wires up to this unfinished tiny attic above her room like 4 years ago, and was like, yeah, I'll just go in there and hook them all up to the
This was when? Around Christmas time.
Oh, when I was working on it?
Yeah.
I was working on it like the week after Christmas, and I must have been crawling around in this little attic. All I had to do was connect four legs of the wires that I threw up over the wall into the attic when I built her bedroom.
And then the plan was to put a junction box up there and connect them to...
Yeah, there was already a box that I had put in from when I put a new sub panel up there, but there's always like little snags. Like one wire was a little too far from where I wanted the junction box, and then I had to put another box in, and I ended up just putting several boxes along the way instead of doing like home runs down to the one junction box, and just kind of jumped it from box to box.
That's pretty hacky.
It's pretty hacky? Well, no, I mean, like, think about it. If you were running electrical wires for outlets in a room, you would run the wire to each box, and then you pull a leg off to each to each one. That's what I did. So I wasn't like running them in series, through the electrical outlets or anything like that. But also I wanted to get them above the floor because I want to insulate better in there. And they were like the previous boxes were all just right on the ceiling joists, and so it was just crawling around in this filthy.
Did you take the opportunity to air seal the ceiling penetrations?
I will be doing that when I go into insulating. Because at first I was like, let me just get this insulation done, and I'm like, no, I can actually see into the tops of some of the wall cavities.
That makes a huge difference.
Oh yeah, and I even found there used to be a brick chimney in there, and I found some damp fiberglass insulation where there was a pile of old bricks from when the chimney got pulled down, and I haven't quite figured out why that fiberglass was damp yet. So it might be air leakage from our laundry room below going up through the fiberglass.
Might have a raccoon.
Just peeing on it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised. I thought I heard something scurrying around up there recently. But crawling around in a dirty, filthy, fiberglass-filled 150-year-old attic for 4 hours wasn't my...
It's disgusting.
Yeah, it wasn't the best.
I hope you wore a respirator.
I wear a mask. I wear rubber gloves.
Did you wear a Tyvek suit?
I did not wear a Tyvek suit.
It's pretty nice to be able to just like take that off and not get dirt all over your house.
Yeah, but I did take this. My daughter's 13 years old, and I don't involve her enough in the remodeling project.
That's what she says?
She's never shown a whole lot of interest, let's say, put it that way. And so, I try to give her little bits and pieces and talk about, why it was as complicated as it was and what you should do to make it easier and safe and all that stuff. Like you're talking about labeling the black leads. Well, I always, whenever I run wires, especially if I'm not going to get to them right away, at both ends of the wires, I always take a Sharpie and write where the wire is going or what it's intended for.
Yeah, because not that it takes a whole lot of time, but to try to figure out which is like the load and which is the line, if you've got two wires or two cables coming into a box, takes a little bit of time.
Way more than writing it on the cable the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I could say even the electrician who redid my panel, there were a couple of... even with the tone, trying to find the tone, using the tone, what was that device they used to like
a tone continuity test?
Yeah, they struggled to find a few of the runs in my house because it's just a big bowl of spaghetti from 150 years of different wiring systems.
Yeah.
That's the difficulty when you have a house that was wired over decades instead of all at once, right?
Yeah.
It's like
luckily,
always added to, never complete.
Luckily, the previous owner, I know, completely eliminated all the old knob and tube and all that kind of stuff, and ran Romex and BX throughout the house sometime in the 70s. So.
I don't know much to report. I did go to Pittsburgh, and I did try to have the meetup event, and we did have 6 respondents, but unfortunately, they literally were on all 4 corners of the city of Pittsburgh, which meant that somebody was driving an hour or 2 just to meet in a central location. And the other part of the equation was to keep the peace. I didn't want to be gone for an entire day while visiting my family, so I'm sorry for all of you who intended to go, but I tell you what, the next time in Pittsburgh, we're going to set up a time and place ahead of time, which I think will prevent some of the difficulty we had in scheduling a get-together in Pittsburgh. But thank you to all of you who expressed an interest. And Andy Grace even said he wanted to go, but we just couldn't make it happen, unfortunately.
Well, I know we're going to mention this later, but speaking of meetups, we have to mention... We're going to be at IBS. When this podcast airs, it'll be the following week. And last year we had, I think, one of our best meetups ever, which was in the middle of the Builders Show at the Hard Rock Casino and Hotel. And then we're going to have it on the same location again at the, what did we say? Craft plus Community Bar, which is in the hotel lobby. So it's not hard to find. And but we'll have a link in the podcast notes where if you just go to finehomebuilding.com, and you can sign up for that. It's a fundraiser for the Keep Craft Alive Scholarship, but it's just a great opportunity to meet people in the trades from around the country. And we had a great turnout last year, and we really hope to see a lot of the same people back this year.
Go, it's fun. That's all I can say. So our first question comes from Tess. Hello, FHB podcasters. You asked for design questions, so here goes. My husband and I bought our first house in St. Paul, Minnesota, and are beginning to remodel. I'm a user experience strategist with a BFA and minor in sustainability, whose father is an overqualified metallurgical engineer. Needless to say, I know enough to be dangerous, and I'm looking for you all for advice. I recently purchased A Field Guide to American Houses, the definitive guide to identifying and understanding America's domestic architecture. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. It's like a birding guide for architecture. On page 608, image 3, I've identified my house as a 1955 minimal ranch, basically a half a ranch. The entire neighborhood is made up of the same house with small variable differences attached as a photo. It is adorable little house. So like in much of America, after the World War II, developers built a bunch of affordable small houses all over the place in neighborhoods. And we haven't seen this kind of thing, I would say, since. She says, I'm fine with the 888 square feet since it's just a 75-pound fluff ball, my husband and I. We're not looking to knock down walls since I believe you can have a high-quality house with reasonable square footage. Design-wise, we're aiming for mid-century modern with Scandinavian/Shaker influences. The problem is I can't find any resource that can tell me the aesthetic interior design rules for each style. Is there a field guide to American houses equivalent for interiors? Shout out to your article, Well-Proportioned Trim by Bud Dietrich. I feel vindicated for my hatred of the original trim dimensions in this house and have already pulled all of it up in the office using the trim puller. Attached are some quick mock-ups of what we're looking to do in its place. Solicited advice welcomed.
Well, so that little ranch house there, I mean, she's picked the right style because...
Simple.
A simple box like that with a
Should we try and explain
roof.
what she has here?
It really is
trim-wise?
just... I mean, it really is just a tiny...
Square edge stock.
Tiny ranch. Oh, and the trim, yeah.
Square edge stock with a shoe mold, except it's probably 3/4 thick by 2 inches tall. So that's my only problem with the whole thing is I think the shoe mold is just a little too tall. I think it's should be like probably 5/8 of an inch shorter, but otherwise I think it's fine. It matches the house.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's very similar to what I have, although I haven't put any shoe mold in yet.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't even finished the baseboards, to be honest. And I don't think I've actually ripped out all the base in the entire house. But yeah, it's slowly coming back together, but that's very similar to what I have. As far as resources...
we don't know.
Well, so no, I did a little poking around. I mean, and I think she was looking for a definitive guide like that one she was talking about, but I think she should go a little bit more focused on what she's looking for. I found a couple of books in particular. There's one called Mid-Century Modern Interiors, Furniture, Design Details by Bradley Quinn. And honestly, if you go to Goodreads.com, there's a lot of if you're going to look for books like this, I think you get a lot more high quality reviews than you would on, say, Amazon if you're looking for this type of stuff.
So is this bookseller specialized in architectural titles, or is it a mix match?
No, I mean, I was just looking. I just did sort of a broad search based on my architectural knowledge and was looking for things that were along the lines of stuff I saw as high quality, covering the details. I mean, and obviously Scandinavian and mid-century modern go really well. I mean, that's been a popular style in that part of the world since the early to mid 20th century.
Yep.
And so I found another book called Scandinavian Home, a comprehensive guide to mid-century modern Scandinavian designers. And I think just looking at examples, a lot of that work is going to be better than looking for a guide that's going to give you specific descriptions of trim proportions or anything like that. I mean, the basis of mid-century design comes from the early 20th century Bauhaus and international styles, which were sort of a reaction to the overdone
gaudy
Victorian stuff. And a lot of that also had a lot of political and sociological background too, about just living simpler and really what it comes down to is it's about minimal adornment, minimal detailing, and really practical open spaces. And typically you see a lot of big windows, but as far as trim goes, it's really keep it as simple as possible. So, I mean, I might even skip the shoe molding altogether.
So my guess is she has the shoe mold there because if you look at the oak floor
to cover
that is the only reason that I want to put any in my house is because that's the way the floor is.
For those of you
installed.
listening, where she pulled off the baseboard in existing shoe mold, the oak floor is either unfinished or significantly lighter because it hasn't oxidized. So in order to hide that discrepancy in the finish color, she's made the trim at least as thick as it was originally.
And beyond that, in my house, the flooring itself is like short of the walls.
It doesn't reach. That's very common.
Yeah, so the base, it's 1 by base, so 3/4 actual. And there are occasional gaps.
Yep.
Yeah. But I do like the idea of using a square-edged shoe mold if you're going for a modern style like that, because I feel like a quarter round it looks kind of old-fashioned and kind of like it's just there to cover up some sins.
Yes.
Yeah.
So on to the most important part of this conversation here with Tess. So Tess, in the photograph she sent us, included her mock-up of the trim detail, and it's held in place by this very large volume of book. And I couldn't help but be interested in what this huge book was. So are you curious?
I am. At first, when I first looked at it, I thought it was like one of those like have a heart rat trap type things.
So it's the Macmillan Book of Proverbs, Maxims, and Famous Phrases. So we'll have to ask Tess for some help with some witty things to come up with for the podcast.
Did you figure that on your own with a magnifying glass?
I did.
Yeah?
Yes,
Okay.
I blew up the photo and I was able to read the spine.
Okay.
Also, I mean, I would recommend just taking some field trips.
What do you like?
I mean, she's in the Midwest, and there's a bunch of Frank Lloyd Wright houses around
prairie
there.
style. Yeah.
She could go to Eastern New York and go to New Lebanon and go to some of the Shaker communities there, or Hancock Shaker Village right over the border in Massachusetts, or go to IKEA.
Right.
But honestly, you said Minnesota, is that right?
Yeah.
The upper Midwest is actually sort of an epicenter of mid-century, like friends of ours who, when on junk day you see people throw out their old junk and furniture on the side of the road. Well, a friend of ours who lives in Chicago says that you will routinely see mid-century modern furniture because there's just generations who have, probably inherited their parents' houses and they don't have that same interest in that style. And you go to a lot of the junk stores around there, you can find some good mid-century modern furniture to go with this style. But in general, that area, you could probably find plenty of examples of by famous architects of museums to go visit to see the houses.
Yeah, you can tour these houses and bring a tape measure and
a photo and a camera.
and a camera.
And put the tape up in the image, right? And then take a picture, and then you know how big the stuff is.
Yep.
That's what we do at Fine Homebuilding when we have to.
Oh yeah.
You bring home source materials for an illustration or whatever. That's invaluable. Mm-hmm. You don't do that one time, and you never forget again. So, I forget this person's first name, but he says, "Hi, we have a 3-season cabin in the Adirondacks, zip code 12808, which is about 20 miles north of Lake George. A few years ago, we closed the crawl space, insulated the walls with foam, added a vapor barrier to the floor, and replaced all the copper pipes with PEX. We fully drain the water in fall and turn it back on in the spring once the winter is over. We're trying to come up with a better solution so we can use the cabin more in the winter. Presently, we have a gas fireplace and some space heaters. The process of turning on the water for a weekend and then draining it is more trouble than it's worth. I would like to keep the heat on about 50 all winter long, but am concerned about cost and the ability to produce the correct amount of BTUs to maintain the desired 50 degrees. What is the best approach to this issue?" Bam. I love this question.
So
I have so many opinions on this.
I looked up where this is. This is somewhere between Schroon Lake and Brant Lake, which
Scroon.
is Scroon. Is it
Yeah,
Scroon? Oh,
Scroon.
you're from that area, right?
It's cold, right,
Which
Matt?
is just,
It's very cold.
yes. I mean, I have an aunt and uncle who have a similar cabin just over the hill from them on Lake George, and yeah, they have to deal with that every single time they go up there. And I think it really all comes down to where is their water coming from? Do they have a well that they can be using in the wintertime? Did he specify
Why are you talking
that?
about the well?
Well, because the water has to get into the house.
Well, if you keep the house warm, you don't even have to worry about the water.
No, but like for instance, my aunt and uncle's cabin, their water comes from Lake George, goes
Above ground.
above ground to a pump house through a culvert,
So you can't fix
down
that.
the road, up the road again, and then up the hill into their house. So like obviously you got to know where the water is coming from.
Well, let's assume that his water is from a more conventional well and is not outside the house, right?
Yeah.
Or its service is underground, so it's not going to freeze. Can we assume that?
I guess we can assume that.
I think we should, because he didn't ask about keeping the water from freezing. He mentioned how to keep the pipes from bursting in the cabin.
Yep.
What do you think? Am I looking at the wrong question?
No, I think you're right. Yeah, and I don't know. I think you got to insulate the heck out of this place to start. I don't know.
They put the spray foam in.
Yeah.
They sealed up the basement. I think they're on the right thing. I think they just need to have the gas log is not the right heating plant to keep this conditioned all the time, right? You put that on and you sit in front of it and it makes some heat. But they need a central heating system, whether it's mini splits or a forced air system or a boiler, or what most people or many people did in Vermont with vacation homes that I knew had what was generically described as a monitor heater. Some people call them a Rinnai heater, but it's a wall furnace. It's got a flue that goes out the wall. Some of them use electricity, some of them don't. So the advantage there is if you have one that doesn't use electricity, it'll still keep the place warm if you have a power failure. And on a seasonal property, that's the huge risk, right? Is if your power goes out and the furnace can't run and the pipes are going to freeze, right? So I think you need to figure out what kind of heating plan it is. And then depending on what system you select, guides on how you can control it remotely. And this is a lot easier than it used to be. Back in the day, you used to plug this thing into your phone and you would call it up when you wanted to check on the heat in your building. And if it answered or rang, you knew that the heat was on. If it wouldn't pick up, it was because the temperature had dropped and opened this switch that your phone wouldn't ring. So then you had to call someone else and get them over there to check and see what's going on. Now companies have monitoring hardware and software associated with their heating and cooling equipment, so you can control it from somewhere else and you can monitor the temperature. A really low-tech way is to get an indoor-outdoor thermometer and a webcam and point the webcam at it and check in on it every few hours or every day or whatever, and then deal with the inevitable power interruption that turns your heat off. And if you want to get super high-tech, like if you get the Mitsubishi mini splits, which to me makes a lot of sense in this application, right? They have monitoring software that's web-based, and it's called Kumo Cloud. And you can tell it to turn up the heat before you go. You can monitor the temperature from a distance. Like, I think you need to talk to an HVAC contractor about the equipment first, and then decide of a control that can be remotely monitored and turned up and down as you want to use the space.
It looks like, though, his insulation work was limited to the crawl space. I mean, in that environment,
right.
It is very cold.
It's going to take tons of energy to keep the place heated. So you're suggesting
Well, I think he still needs to insulate the heck out of the walls and the ceiling in that place.
Otherwise you'll go broke.
Otherwise,
yeah.
heating it, and it doesn't matter what you're heating it with, you're going to go broke.
But now, I've seen some people who build vacation homes in cold climates put forth the idea of building basically a utility core where you're only heating a small portion of the space. So it might even be a lot more efficient to change the water system a little bit so you can drain portions of it easier instead of trying to drain the whole system down, and then having a smaller portion of the house conditioned.
I think that's good advice.
Move the bathroom and kitchen to the basement. No. Don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, because the thing is, I've seen this so many times with people who have old houses where they just keep going through the motions of using the old systems of blowing out lines and draining lines here and there, when if with a little bit of rearrangement of your plumbing systems and some better valves or better located valves, you might not need to drain back everything if you can insulate some of it really well and heat just a portion of it.
Yeah.
Well, like we say so often, maybe the best start here is an energy audit to really determine like how much heat you need, where it's leaking out of the building, fix those things, and then address the heating plant and some kind of control system that you could, monitor and change the temperature as you wanted to use the building.
Yeah. Do you know if New York has any subsidized energy audits? I know Connecticut does.
I don't know if they do right now. There was some program a while ago, and I know Myron Ferguson was involved in that somewhat, but I know it was kind of a poop show, whatever they were doing.
I'm curious if those programs even apply to a second home. I wonder.
I'm not sure. Doesn't Myron live up that direction? Can he just stop by and take a look at this place for us?
Yeah, he's probably about an hour south of them. Yep.
So I'd like to hear more about what you decide to do, because this is a common problem, and I think we need more information to have a definitive line in the sand, but like check the envelope, make sure it's good, pick a heating plant that addresses your comfort issues and uses an energy source that is easy to deal with. Then worry about keeping it warm. Chris from Fredonia, New York writes, "Hello, FHB crew. While I was running new boiler venting to eliminate my old brick chimney, I was working in the crawl space beneath the bathroom addition that's not part of the original house. I had never been in there since we moved in. Anyway, I'm clearing out all the old junk when I look up to see this. Apparently that pesky floor joist was directly in the way of this plumber. It's fine, it's just underneath my heavy cast iron tub. It looks like I'll be spending some more time down here after all. The only upside, I guess, is I found some old scraps from when the addition must have been built that I could use for repairs. My guess is that hunk of floor joist that the plumber cut out is probably still in the basement." Do you want to explain what we're looking at, Matt?
This mess, let me see if I can bring it up. Anyway,
it's right there.
Somebody cut entirely through a joist to put
the whole depth.
The entire depth of it to
and the floorboards above it. So there's like nothing.
Right.
And it's probably, a 12 or 18-inch piece of joist is completely missing?
And that was actually in order to install the tub on top of it. It looks like, because that's the drain at the bottom of the tub.
Yeah, it's the shoe on the bottom of the tub.
Yep.
Yeah, that's always a good idea. Well, it is over the edge of some wall, so maybe something else is kind of holding
But interestingly, the joist is not bearing on the masonry wall that's directly next to it, right? It's aside it.
Well, maybe you could stick some blocks on the other side of that wall and fasten them to the joist to...
What is the fix here? I think a couple posts, right? And some small footings. What do you think, Matt?
That was my first thought on this.
Easy fix, right?
Yeah, that's probably the easiest way. You can dig down 12 inches or so, put a little 12 by 12 pad.
I mean, it's very little load, even with the tub full, but...
Yeah.
Yeah, why do plumbers do this? So you can't sister because there's no room, right?
Right.
You got the pipe is now in the way of sistering another joist, and the foundation wall is in the way on the other side. So I kind of think a pair of posts with little footings are the way to solve this. Simpson makes a shoe, I think they call it, to repair studs and stuff that have big holes in them, but that's not going to work in this instance.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some other ones too, but it wouldn't work in this situation. I mean, if you rearrange the plumbing, maybe. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can rearrange the plumbing there. Probably, I don't know how easily, but and then try to sister in there or replace that joist.
I
Get a different tub, reorient it.
But also, like you said, do we know what's on the other side of that? There's a masonry wall directly underneath and adjacent to this joist. So, I mean, maybe there is some way to get something on the other side of the joist.
a shorter depth joist on that bears on that masonry or concrete, whatever it is. Yeah, so I can't tell you how many bathroom remodels where I've seen wood butchery of various degrees by plumbers. This is among the more egregious cuts.
Would you guess that it's just somebody being lazy or somebody being clueless in a situation like this?
Or pissed off, I think, is the other thing. Well, I'll fix them, I can't help but think that that's part of some plumbers are just like,
with some
you
plumbers,
didn't leave me any options, so I'm just going to cut.
It was some plumber's mother-in-law's house.
I mean, I've seen houses where someone took down a plaster ceiling or a drywall ceiling, and the room was like 20 feet long, and the joists were running perpendicular, and they notched every single joist the length of the room to
run the pipes on top.
To run like a 4 or 6 inch cast iron drain pipe across the whole room. So basically, every single joist only had like an inch or two left at the top of it,
and yet it's still standing somehow, right? That's always the part that amazes me. Is there's seldom like any noticeable structural deficiencies, but you just look at it and you're like, how is this working?
Yeah, relying on the thick,
floor sheathing,
thick old floor sheathing they had. Yeah.
And I mean, I kind of excuse it in a house that had plumbing added to it. Like a lot of the houses I worked on in Pittsburgh were built without indoor plumbing. Mm-hmm. And inevitably someone like encloses a little space with a couple of partition walls and then has to figure out how to run the pipes to the fixtures. And in those instances, like you just, like you said, you cut the tops of the joists and run the pipes there. But in a new build, a room addition, like that had plumbing in it originally, it seems kind of egregious.
So in my house, plumbing, heating, everything was added later because the house was built prior to any of that stuff being in our region. And it was weird because in some parts of the house, like the kitchen, they somehow buried the pipes in the wall to get upstairs. But then in this front parlor, they ran all the plumbing for the second floor bathroom and all the radiators on the second floor just outside of the walls.
Yeah, in a chase, or did they just put the pipes in?
Well, for the bathroom plumbing, they made a chase out of beadboard. It was just like a box with like screws against the wall. And then, for all the radiators, they just ran 2 pipes parallel up the wall, like they're exposed with the little flanges, like decorative flanges where they go through the penetration in the floor. And I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like the look of the old house. I left them in a lot of places.
I see that all over the place, and I kind of wonder if it was part like when people used to have electric lights in the very early part of the 20th century, they left the bulbs exposed because you wanted all your neighbors to see your fancy electric lights, right? And I just like, wow, look at my fancy indoor heating system.
Yeah.
What was the question on this? Oh, what to do about this?
I mean, there's a few options depending on what we're not seeing outside of the picture. There's an adjacent masonry wall that maybe could have some blocking put on top of it. There's it's an unused space. Having a couple of posts and some footings probably wouldn't be a hassle. Wouldn't be a hindrance of the use of the space. I guess you could probably just put a whole nother joist away from the pipes a little bit on this side, but that seems like more work than it's worth.
The post?
I think post is probably the way to go.
Because it's a crawl space. No one's going in there.
Yeah.
This is another favorite question here. Hey team, I discovered the podcast a few months ago. I've been rapidly listening through all the archived episodes as I build/renovate my home. This leaves your voices in my head whenever I'm planning out my next tasks. Horrifying, I know.
Poor guy.
Well, the pseudo-schizophrenia that you've induced has led me to an interesting thought. Sadly, I was too far along in my build when I started listening to implement all of your important practices that I've learned from the discussions, like air sealing. Despite this, I still like to think about how I would build differently in the future and the possible impact it would have. This has led me to this question. Currently, I'm about to install the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, and I'm wondering if by air sealing a house, and more specifically around the openings in the ceiling drywall for a hardwired detector, could we be impacting the efficacy of these devices? it's not a sealed, and in a not sealed house that has a positive indoor pressure, we would be pushing more air past these devices as it escapes around them through the hole in the drywall. I'm thinking that would help these devices better detect smoke or carbon monoxide. Tom. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, those devices are designed to be mounted on a flush surface, not necessarily near any holes in the wall. So
Well, he's talking about the whole. So they have
No,
this
the whole-
electrical box, right? And then he's talking about the drywall gap between the box and the drywall.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just try to air seal those holes as best I could.
I kind of think it'd have the opposite effect. I kind of think if you had less dilution from outside air, right, that the CO and smoke detector would actually sound sooner rather than later.
Yeah, well, plus, dust can affect the efficacy of those devices.
Ask me how I know.
How do you know?
Because we had one going off, and I changed the battery, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And just before I threw it in the trash, I took it out to the shop and blew all the dirt out of it, which included a spider and some spider web, and then it worked fine. So,
yeah, so you don't want to be sucking. I mean, he's assuming there's going to be negative pressure pushing air out or whatever direction.
Positive pressure pushing air
positive
past
pressure out, but there's nothing to say that there's not going to be at some point air coming in from some dusty wall cavity, bringing more dust into that device, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think even if you didn't air seal the rest of the house, take every chance you can get while you're doing new stuff to air seal.
Yeah.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, I wasn't 100% clear on what he meant by it would decrease its efficacy, like the amount of air moving past
suggesting,
it, or just the depth.
He's
the dust.
suggesting that
It had like a Venturi effect
because
where it's like
air is not blowing around the junction box where it's connected, that it's going to get smoke later than if it were being carried by the air leaks around this box. And I think he's creative, but I don't think that's a real thing.
Yeah, so he's saying that the air being sucked through the electrical box is going to draw air into the device faster than if it was just blowing by on the surface in the room.
Maybe. I mean, I don't think that's going to have any impact on the efficacy of the box. I mean, it's just measuring the concentration of whatever contaminant in the air.
Yeah, and my suggestion is that it would get to the concentration where it would sound sooner if there were fewer air leaks, but that's speculation on my part.
Yeah, I mean, that nuisance tripping or whatever.
Right.
So like a variation of that is what I would be concerned about, maybe, but probably not really.
Not really.
Yeah. I mean, regardless, I mean, if the difference is even measurable, it's not something I would try to factor into my design of how I'm installing a device like this. I mean, it's if you can air seal the box, make it better.
Yeah, agreed. We're going to hear from like a dozen firefighters in the subsequent.
Good. Tell us what we don't know.
I thought it was an interesting question. I'm like, well, I never really thought about that.
Yeah.
Well, so we want to remind folks, Rob, right, about the Keep Craft Alive event at the Las Vegas Hard Rock Casino and Hotel at the Craft and Community Bar on Wednesday, January 22.
Second.
Thank you.
Thank you.
6 to 8, Jeff? Sure.
I'm not sure.
It's somewhere close to that.
I will be there at 6.
Yeah, I think it might be 5:30, but we'll put all the details on the show notes.
On the podcast page. Yeah, good idea.
Yeah.
You guys have anything to add?
No.
Oh, I have one thing. So, two people have written to the podcast in recent days requesting information about evaporative coolers. And as you all who are regular listeners might surmise, evaporative coolers are not for our New England climate. So I will be the first to admit I know nothing about these things. In a nutshell, it uses evaporated water or water added to the air to cool you off. So in the desert Southwest, people use these as a substitute for air conditioning because since they don't have a refrigeration cycle, they are a lot more energy efficient. They don't use nearly as much electricity. And in the right dry climate, they can make you a lot more comfortable and your house more comfortable. But we don't know anything about them because they would not work at all where we are at.
I've seen them,
You have?
Yeah. Oh, in Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan.
Because people wouldn't really, they didn't have electricity in a lot of these places, and they would take like these swamp grasses essentially that grew in the canals in Helmand, and it would be dried out, and they would have these just like cut out openings in the wall, usually somewhere near the bottom on like a shady side, and they would stick a bunch of this grass in the wall, and they would spray water on it, and then
the wind
usually
would blow.
there was like a higher opening somewhere in these mud hut houses, and it would just sort of draw through, and it did feel reasonably comfortable in those houses when it was blistering hot outside.
That is very cool.
Yeah, it's just taking advantage of the phase change of the water from liquid to vapor. So
I love that is like the most rudimentary description of how this works. That is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And it was swamp grass, and this is also called, for those of you who don't know, a swamp cooler.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So any of you out there who know anything about this, I would be grateful to hear from you, because I want to pick your brain about how these work, how to design them into a central system. Can that be done? What are the disadvantages? A little incidental research I did on them. Some people have worried about Legionnaire's disease. I don't think that's really a concern, but I want to know more. So,
yeah.
I mean, I would think the biggest concern is as much about, do they actually work in your climate, but do they cause damage in your climate because of elevating the moisture levels?
I think it's all about where.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks to all you guys for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com, and please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Happy building. Thanks for listening. Keep craft alive.